Welcome. Yeah, thank you, Brian, for that great introduction. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon and speak to you about a project that I wrapped up last fall, last summer actually, but I've been working on for several years with the Forest Growth Organization of Western Canada. And my title for today is some surprising and perhaps not so surprising results from analysis of managed stand development as influenced by silviculture and other factors in Alberta. Known as the Empirical Post-Harvest Project. And just in case any of you are curious, Katrina Froese, who's speaking next week, is my sister. So it is, in fact, a really small world that I find myself coming to Alberta to join not only the community of growth and yield foresters and professionals there, but again, to live in the same town as my sister. Before I speak about the project details, I'd like to make some acknowledgments. Funding for this project came from FGrOW via a FRIP Open Funds project sponsored by Miller Western Forest Products. And the project team included Tim McCready at Miller Western, Sharon Meredith in her role at FGrOW at the time as the director prior to Brian, Kat Froese for the Government of Alberta, and Phil Como at the University of Alberta. And I'd like to thank the project team for the guidance that they provided, as well as broader FGrOW membership during the time I was working on this project. So the focus of this project is on post-harvest reforested stands. Post-harvest is a term actually that I hadn't encountered. Obviously, these are stands post-harvest, but stands that have been harvested and reforested in Alberta in contrast to natural stands or those that might have originated after a wildfire. Because of the nature of forests in the West, there's an increasing emphasis on reforested or post-harvest stands on the landscape in Alberta, and historically a paucity of data on those stand types that has been remedied over the last few decades with an increasing emphasis on measuring reforested stand development and installing permanent sample plots in post-harvest stands. So the goal of this project was to take advantage of these newly available data and simply answer some questions about development through time and responses to silviculture. The EPH project had 3 sets of related objectives, and I have 3 sets of analyses that tie to each of these. The first was to identify in post-harvest empirical data impacts of silviculture on reforestation success and growth. We know silviculture is an important and powerful tool in stand development, but the goal of this project was to identify the impacts quantitatively in the EPH measured data. The second objective was to explore changes in succession and forest structure over time, to essentially test the question about how static our understanding is of forest stand development, especially when assessed with early stand developmental data, compared to those stands that we might have the opportunity to measure repeatedly through a period of time. And the third project objective was to assess the ability of growth models to forecast post-harvest conditions. Growth models play an incredibly important role in sustainable forest management in Alberta and elsewhere. And given that we're using silviculture to influence stand development, we want to make sure that forest growth models are capturing the effects of silviculture when using them to develop predictions of stand development and of future forest yield. So there are quite a few data sets that were involved in the EPH project, and I apologize for this slightly busy slide, but there's a lot going on here, and this was a big project, so there'll be a lot of details to discuss throughout. Essentially, there were 3 kinds of data that were used to characterize post-harvest stands. The third kind is over there on the right in this lighter green box called the EPH remeasure dataset. But before I describe those, let me describe the 2 on the left. The top box, historic data, these were from historic programs that were installed in Alberta in the late 1980s and the early 1990s to examine post-harvest stand development. These were from 3 programs, JSSR, YSI, and MSYI, that were installed in stands around age 10 to 30. And a subset of those were remeasured specifically for the EPH project. And some of them, most of them, in fact, were remeasured twice. That's why I have EPH1 and EPH2 here. The EPH2 project, those were measured in about 2017, and they were part of this project, the analysis part of the project that I'm explaining now. So after a period of time, those stands were about 27 to 55 years old when they became part of the EPH remeasured data set. The third data set is RSA performance data down there in the bottom left at around age 12 to 14. RSA stands for Regeneration Standard of Alberta, and these are performance survey data that are collected in a very methodical and unbiased way across the reforested performance post-harvest stand land base in Alberta. And again, a subset of these stands were remeasured specifically as part of the EPH2 project, and they're contributing to that EPH remeasured data set over on the right at around age 19 to 22. So what we have on the left is a very large collection of once-in-time measurements of reforested stands in Alberta, and over on the right, a subset of a smaller set of about 58 stands that had been remeasured, most of them twice, at later ages that allow us to see how those stands are changing through time. And over there on the right was one of the stands I was fortunate to visit in the vicinity of Hinton in 2018. Now, these aren't the only data, however. The other data available were from the PGI, or the Provincial Growth and Yield Initiative database. These are PSPs that were filtered to identify those PSPs that were from post-harvest stands or had captured post-harvest stand conditions and had silviculture records that were available to connect to them for analysis. So together, these constituted a very large, comprehensive, geographically and temporally database to explore post-harvest stand development. So these three related sets of analyses, I'm going to discuss those next. And the first one is about stand condition at performance age. So in Alberta, a survey is required as part of the reforestation standard at about age 14, 12 to 14. And this is done in a statistically rigorous fashion that includes subsampling from cover type strata, and from those cover type strata, the installation of grids of plots across reforested openings. On the left is a photograph or an aerial image of a couple of the stands that I was fortunate to visit at the same time in 2018. And from this rigorous network of points, data are collected on stocking by species, and also from a subset of these points on site quality, and often on, in some cases, information on diameter that allow us to calculate basal areas as well. You can see on the right the geographic distribution of those 6,000 operational age 14 performance surveys that were available for this project. They span the forested cover types of Alberta that are actively managed, and obviously a large amount of them are concentrated in the foothills region, but also they're also spread throughout the mixedwood region in Alberta as well. So from these data, I was able to ask the first basic question, which is, how are forested or reforested stands in Alberta developing in comparison to the implied management intent? So in Alberta, it's required for each timber opening that there be a declaration to a cover type, a broad cover group. It's now changed to a more finer resolution. But at the time when these data were collected, to 4 different strata. Those are deciduous, a deciduous leading mixedwood, that's DC, a coniferous leading mixedwood, that's CD, and a pure conifer stand that's greater than 80% or 80% or greater conifer, that's a C. So we can examine whether post-harvest stands are achieving structures or conditions that that mirror what was intended. So on the left-hand side of this table, I have the final declaration, or the declaration that was made of the intended condition, and then I'm going to summarize areas by the database stratum, so looking at the actual stands at age 14 to see what strata they fell into. And here's what the data show. The exact numbers aren't that important. Along the diagonal, there are some lighter green boxes. Those represent ideal scenarios. So you're declared as, an opening to deciduous, and it achieved a deciduous strata definition at age 14. What you can see over in the right is essentially the fraction of the area by stratum that was in the condition that it was declared to by performance age. It's pretty good for deciduous, but there isn't a lot of area in this category because at that time these were just that stratum was being surveyed differently. But you can see overall across the entire area, the success rate in the sense of the actual condition at age 14 matching what was declared was only about 39%. That ranged from a high of about 46% for those that were declared deciduous leading mixed woods to a low of 25% for those that were declared coniferous leading mixed woods. What this means is that declaration is itself not a reliable indicator of stand condition at performance age. Now, this sounds like a strong concerning result, but of course, performance age is just one age across the entire length of a rotation, and there's no reason to believe that these database strata would necessarily persist throughout time. In Alberta, since a decade or so ago, there's a finer resolution stratification system that's been used that describes strata not only by the composition of deciduous and conifer, but also by the leading conifer species. So on the left, I've got final declaration again, which is the information I had available in the data that were supplied to me. And I have the actual data-based qualification or classification of the base 10 stratum and total area by hectares. Again, the light blue boxes tell you where things are okay, that the data-based 10 stratum is actually what was declared. And you can see that for the most part, when there's a miss, when the database stratum is different from the declared stratum, it's because there's more deciduous. That's what HW stands for, hardwood, because there's more deciduous than intended. But when that miss happens, it's most commonly in the case when spruce was the targeted leading conifer. You can see the blue boxes highlight for the CD declaration, those that are coniferous or deciduous leading mixed woods with a conifer component. There's far greater amounts of area in the spruce leading than the pine leading category. A subtle difference is actually in the coniferous leading mixed wood. In that case, the misses are most common where pine was intended, but notably these were intended to be pure conifer stands. So the bottom line here is that there's a lot more deciduous on the land base at age 14 than what might be expected by final declaration. So the goal, though, in this project was to dig a little deeper and look at stand condition as related to silviculture and other variables like ecology that might affect stand condition through time. It poses an interesting question, which is how exactly do you define stand condition? And I've got a few notes I was scribbling down at the time as I was trying to think this through. I mean, the condition of a stand is intrinsically a multivariate thing. There's components of stockings, which might be a spatial pattern, density, site index, height, age, sort of other derived attributes, maybe like quadratic mean diameter, and also in Alberta, the presence of western gall rust, which is an important disease that affects trees. It has components of composition and structure. Much of what we do in evaluating condition, we first start with doing some kind of pattern detection or dimensionality reduction. So we put things in strata in part because it's such a multivariate problem and we want to lump things together so they can make more sense. There's a lot of focus on MAI as a synthetic metric because it's a metric that's so important in sustained yield management, at least in Western Canada. But often when we're looking at stand condition, we're trying to describe it, but also explain how it got there. And it's not always clear exactly what really matters. So I thought about this for a while. If I was to impose a structure that was defined by the base 10 stratum or the broad cover group, I could maybe divide the data set up into boxes. So some obvious ways of dividing the data set would be by cover type or base 10 stratum, maybe by natural subregion, which is an ecological classification in Alberta, maybe by species group. The data as supplied to me had kind of a 10 group silviculture class already predefined. But if you take that combination, there's 10 strata, 6 subregions, maybe 4 species groups, and 10 silviculture classes. That's 2,400 combinations of stand conditions that I might then have to dig into and look at things like height or density or site index. If you look at those just four attributes and multiply 2,400 by 4, you end up with 9,600 combinations. That's a lot of boxes to generate summaries for. So I thought, why don't I just let the data speak instead of trying to impose these artificial clusters or groupings upon it? And so I started digging into the use of hierarchical clustering techniques. Hierarchical clustering allows data to be defined by natural groupings defined on quantitative attributes. So in Alberta, there are 4 main species groups that are used commonly to define stand composition. The AW stands for aspen, but really it's the hardwood group. SB is black spruce, SW is white spruce, and PL is the pine group. So I took density by species, I put it through a hierarchical clustering algorithm. I used some techniques to find the optimal number of clusters, and this is what came out. It suggests that if you're clustering based on composition, the most efficient way to describe the entire multivariate space of stands in Alberta based on composition are by 3 clusters. And those clusters are, roughly speaking, the first cluster was a deciduous leading mixed wood. The second one was a coniferous leading mixed wood that would be defined under the base 10 system as pine leading because pine was the dominant conifer. And the third cluster was a coniferous leading mixed wood, but this would be defined as spruce leading because spruce was the leading conifer. Composition, though, seems like an overly simplistic way to define forest condition or stand condition. So I also included a metric of stand structure. In this case, it was the Morosita index, which has been used elsewhere in publications in Alberta to look at an index of spatial clustering. A Morosita index of 1 is perfect uniformity, and as it gets larger, it means more clustering. And so when I used hierarchical clustering methods to cluster stands using both their Morosita index for all species or just the dominant species and density by species group, I ended up with an optimum set of 6 clusters. Well, what this suggests is that letting the data speak provides a much more simple description of the overall pattern of variance within Alberta forests. But the purpose of the project was to try to understand how silviculture affects stand condition. So thinking a little bit about, well, what factors cause a stand to fall into one of these individual clusters? Cluster becomes our response variable. It's the stand condition. And some of the predictors that are available to me to answer this question include things like stand age, silviculture history, a treatment class, which is a simplified classification of silvicultural history, tending frequency, site prep frequency, planting frequency, management intent. This is that declaration. A pre-harvest stand condition would be useful, except it was difficult to obtain in Alberta. Ecology, at the site level, maybe natural subregion or ecosite classification. These are all silviculture attributes that I was able to, or they were pre-attached actually to stand level data. And so I used a technique called classification trees to try and model whether we can describe or define which cluster a stand falls into based on attributes. This is just a little example. I think I may have even peeled this off of Wikipedia. But classification trees become these binary trees where the algorithm, it's a non-parametric statistical method where the algorithm searches for the best way to partition the data. So it's like the opposite of clustering together. And now I'm trying to break my data apart and determine whether we can describe how the cluster membership is described by some of these predictor variables. So what did we find? This is some output from clustering packages in the R statistical software. And it's pretty busy, so I'm just going to describe the answer to you in a table or in a summary results. Unfortunately, it wasn't that easy to describe cluster membership using the data that I had available, in part because there were a limited number of clusters, but there's just so much noise when looking at the data this way. It turned out natural subregion was the most powerful method, so I started looking at silviculture of only individual cover types. And here's what I found. The classification trees revealed that pine stands that were declared mixed wood usually were mixed wood when you examine them using the data at performance age. The second thing that I found was that in the lower foothills in particular, when you use silviculture combinations, site prep, planting, and tending, pretty much was successful at creating pure spruce. The silviculture combination of just planting plus tending was successful creating spruce leading mixed woods, and the planting only or site prep plus planting was rarely able to produce pure conifer stands, even if the declaration was to pure conifer. So this was interesting, but a bit of a disappointing result because I was looking for a more powerful silviculture signal in what is fundamentally a really large data set. So thinking about this for a while, and again, turning back to my sort of letting the data speak, it seemed to me that condition is better conceptualized as a gradient. So I started looking at density as a most important variable to describe a stand condition, because we want to achieve at least some kind of minimum density in reforested stands. And when you do a natural log transformation of density, you can fit a really nice multiple linear regression model. So I fit regression models to predict the natural log of density in stems per hectare as a function of a variety of those earlier variables that I described that were available to me. These were some of the nicest multiple linear regression models I've ever fit, in that they met regression assumptions and were often statistically significant. One of the neat things about this particular model, though, is that if you exponentiate base E both sides of this simple, well, okay, it doesn't look that simple, does it? But this regression equation, you end up with a linear model that's multiplicative. So density is basically the multiplier of each of these little terms through the model. So if each of these terms represents one of those predictor variables, you can analyze each of them as essentially a scalar on expected stand density. So in this model, the EXP, or the exponentiation base E of the regression intercept fit that I fit, is the average density for a given species across all forests in the data set. And then this exponentiated base E of each of these individual regression coefficients is a multiplier showing the effect of the treatment. If it's positive, that means you expect more density with that treatment. If it's negative, you expect a reduction. So the best way of, this sounds complicated, but the best way of illustrating this is by example. These are the results for pine. Looking at a pure pine stand, site indexed 18 meters, these are the regression coefficients converted back to multipliers. So what this suggests is that the average density is 372 before you consider site index. You have to multiply it by 3 for site index 18, and then pick which of these predictor variables are appropriate. Here I use these composition clusters from earlier in the analysis. So scale this out for composition cluster 2, that was pine leading coniferous mixedwood, say in the foothills natural region, regenerated naturally with no tending on a mesic site. Our intercept is 372.9, the site index multiplier is 3, the composition cluster multiplier is 1, the natural region multiplier is 2, silviculture multipliers are not used because there's no planting or tending, and it turned out soil nutrient regime was statistically useful in this example, and the multiplier there was 0.8. So 372.9 times 3 times 1 times 2 times 0.8 leads to expected 1,922 trees per hectare. So that's how this kind of model works. But the real power is in looking at the predictor responses for silviculture. And here's what they look like for the 4 major species groups. So the multipliers, remember the multipliers mean they scale up the expected densities or down if the multipliers are less than 1. And so for aspen, you can see 3 of the silviculture variables were statistically useful. Well, actually, they weren't really, because the multiplier for planting was 1. And on the x-axis, I have treatment frequency. This kind of makes sense to me. With each increasing, with an increase in treatment frequency, with 4 site prep events and 4 tending events, you end up with multipliers of about 0.5 on each. The purpose of site prep and tending is to reduce aspen densities to improve survival and growth of conifers. So that makes sense. For pine, planting frequency and tending frequency were both statistically significant. And you can see that the more tending there is, you actually expect a lower density of pine. Initially, with 1 planting event, there's a bump, but that effect diminishes with time. Well, I think this is sensible, because the more you're tending and the more you're planting pine, if you plant pine 4 times, it's because you had trouble getting pine back. And so it makes sense to me that the overall pine densities would be lower if you have to plant pine a lot. For black spruce and white spruce, the tending results were different. For black spruce, increasing amounts of tending lead to less black spruce, but planting certainly has a positive effect. but an initially strong positive effect has a smaller positive effect if you're planting multiple times. That effect is really obvious for planting in white spruce. So this was in contrast to the analysis based on clustering, a really positive outcome. All right, so those analyses up to now that I've been describing were all from the performance survey, the young stand data, all at age 14, a very large operational set. I'm going to shift to the next set of goals, next set of analyses addressing goals in this project, which were empirical trends in development beyond performance age or age 14. And for these, I used 1,200 permanent sample plots in Alberta from the Provincial Growth and Yield Initiative. And again, on the right, there's a graphic showing the distribution of those plots. They're certainly, again, concentrated in the foothills natural region, but there are certainly plenty of plots also in the mixedwood region across eastern and northern Alberta. So again, a large data set, and these are remeasured PSPs. So we are able to look at trends in development with time. So a few key results, and again, this is a big report, so I'm just skimming over some of the real highlights here. The first thing I'd like to point out is that time trends in stand attributes are dirty. Now actually, the graphic on the right is from the Piggy data set. The graphic on the left is from the EPH remeasured data, so I'm just going to cheat a little and talk about those first for a moment. The graph on the left is for pine, and it shows the total age in years of the trees as established from field measurements against the stand age from silviculture records. You'd expect that if the trees were planted in year 1 or year 2 and they're 1 year old, that those trajectories would match the 1-to-1 line perfectly through time, and they'd ideally be sitting right on top of it. But natural regeneration has a lag, so stand age will exceed total age sometimes. The blue lines are actually from those RSA performance surveys, the young stands. And what's interesting about those blue lines is quite a few of them, the lines are tilted down. This is weird because these stands were remeasured 7 years later, but sometimes they were only 5 years older as established by field measurement. That means measurement error. The little bends in the orange lines implies the same kind of thing. And so there's some measurement error happening in characterizing these time trends, and those are going to cascade into estimates of site index. Over there on the right is a graphic of top age. So these are age of top height trees in the Piggy PSP data for white spruce graphed against stand age. Here you can see that many times the lines are perfectly parallel to the 1-to-1 line. That looks like a really awesome result, except in many of these PSPs, age was only determined once from an actual measurement, and afterwards it's simply derived mathematically, but it's stored in the database as if it's real data, and so it leads to a misleading conclusion that there's no measurement error. Obviously, some of those jagged lines, there's some tremendous measurement error, but the most interesting result, I think, is that age is often far greater, tree age is often far greater than stand age, which means there's a lot of advanced regen that are being picked up as top height trees in these Piggy PSP plots that could lead to very misleading estimates of site index. We'll see where that goes in a few minutes. Another key conclusion is that density continues to increase beyond performance age. On the left, again, I have some of the remeasured data from the remeasured EPH plots. These are for pine. And what you can see is that in many of these, the blue ones are from the RSA performance data and the orange lines from those remeasured historic plots. On average, density is declining with time. But with those orange lines, there was often a really long gap between the original measurements in the late 80s and the early 1990s and when they were measured in the early, let's see, I guess it was around 2010 and again around 2017 as part of the EPH project. So any kind of increase in density beyond performance age is not captured very well in this data set. But it is obvious in the blue lines, which were from RSA performance operational inventories at 14 that were then remeasured 7 years later. Over on the right are some plots of pine from the Piggy PSP data. And because there was so much data, there was overplotting. So what I did was divide them into quartiles based on maximum density. And here are just the top 2 quartiles. The red line shows the performance age. And you can see for these dense pine stands, the lines in many cases are continuing to increase even up to age 20 And so this means that density is continuing to increase well beyond performance age, and performance age alone is not sufficient time assessment of stand condition or change in stand condition through time. So to get at the question about succession, I took the piggy PSP data and massaged them a little to generate conifer proportions by basal area and by trees per hectare, in contrast of looking at the raw densities. And I noticed there were some characteristic patterns. And in order to try to pull apart those characteristic patterns, again, I used cluster analysis. And I clustered these based on fitting parabolas. The statistical methods are detailed in the report, but fitting parabolas to the trajectories and clustering on the parameters of the parabolas, which give you maxima and positions of maxima. And so really interesting trends, or some that maybe actually not that surprising upon reflection, emerged. On the left and on the right, you can see two kinds of typical stand trends that are very rapid initial increases in conifer proportion. So far on the left-hand graph, that for the vast majority of these, they meet the pure conifer definition, meaning more than 80%, actually by density in most cases, but density and basal area were the same in these analyses, and basal area was smoother. So I chose to present these results. But they're more than 80% conifer by age 14, and they seem to stay that way. Most of the time in the piggy data, 82% of the time, pine was the leading conifer in this cluster. The graph on the right shows a similar kind of pattern, but it's slower. It looks like most of these stands are close to or exceeding the 80% conifer level that would define them as pure conifer, but it doesn't happen until after age 14. And when I look at the stand composition for this cluster, there's fewer of them that are pine and more of them that are spruce. This is maybe not that surprising because pure pine stands grow rapidly to pure pine stands after reforestation. The more interesting results are in the other two clusters. This cluster on the left shows essentially, now there's some idiosyncrasies in here. I didn't massage these data to pull out all the outliers, but broadly speaking, most cases, this is a slow and increasing proportion of conifer through time that by around age 20 to 30, maybe even beyond, is going to grow past the pure deciduous or 20% conifer and into the deciduous leading conifer mixed wood with time. This is well beyond performance age. And when I look at the proportion of stands by leading conifer in here, 81% of the time, spruce was the dominant conifer species. On the right, there's kind of an intermediate group where that increase in conifer component was much faster. And in this case, still though, 67% of the time, spruce was a leading conifer. So this really points to a really predictable sort of successional development trajectory in these stands with time that isn't well captured just with a static or single time view of the data at performance age. So I was also asked just later in the project to take a look at the stability of site index. And the piggy data are really useful for this because they've been remeasured repeatedly through time. So on the left is a plot of site index for pine in piggy plots where we had enough data to estimate pine site index. There's some trends in there. There's a few that point up and a few that point down. These are all for the same plot through time. But for the most part, you can see pretty flat lines and not a really obvious correlation with stand age. So that suggests that site index is pretty stable in the piggy data. There isn't a trend in site index with time. Over on the right, however, there are some really obvious trends in site index in the EPH remeasured data with time, and they're different dependent upon the two data sets. The blue lines, again, are from the RSA performance survey that were resampled 7 years later, and the orange lines were from those historic stands that were remeasured twice, often quite a few years later. There's a lot of noise in initial estimates of site index, particularly in those EPH historic data. They were pretty small sample sizes for those, so I'm willing to forgive them. But often, really sharp declines in site index in those performance or those historic stands. We'd expect that later, though, we'd have some pretty accurate estimates of site index. But remeasuring these stands 7 to 10 years later, and we often have 4 or 5 meter changes in site index. The blue lines for the RSA performance are all tilted a bit down to the right, or tilted up, I should say, to the left. So site index is increasing in those stands by 3 to 4 years. Well, my theory here is not that there's error, that there's actually a change in site index, or even error in measurement of height, but that age estimation has significant error. And if age is underestimated at a given height, you're going to get a apparent bump in site index. So this suggests that in some surveys in Alberta, there's substantial measurement error that's contributing to uncertainty in productivity as assessed by site index. Okay, the last group of analyses that I want to talk about are addressing that third set of questions in the EPH project, was to assess the ability of growth models to forecast post-harvest condition. And for this, I used only the 84 remeasured performance stands. And the reason for this is that these were RSA performance survey style data. So they used grids of plots across the stands at the same plot locations in the last two measurements. They most closely match the RSA performance survey that's used in Alberta to assess regeneration performance, and how the models are used, particularly the Gypsy model, to assess stand development through time. These were 84 stands were specifically sampled for this project, and you can see the distribution on the right, lots of them in the foothills, but a cluster over in the central mixedwood region near Slave Lake that were included to increase the number of stands that had mixedwood conditions, and these were mostly the performance survey data for the original condition. So 84 stands remeasured, measured twice or 3 times. The first thing, I'm going to just pause for a minute and talk about the way the Gypsy model implies trends in density and stocking. So the Gypsy model projects density forward in time from initial conditions. And just exercising the model, this is a graphic from a Gypsy evaluation report for white spruce using different initial densities, 10,000, 7,500, 5,000, 3,000, and so forth. But also different levels of site index, that's the 3 colors, and different levels of stocking index, that's the amount of clustering in stands. All the variance in here isn't that important, other than to note that Gypsy predicts that stand density decrease in this kind of sigmoid shape through time. A decrease in stand density is effectively modeling mortality through time. So these are the trends that are implied from the Gypsy model. But when we think back about the trends that were observed in density in the PIGGY databases, those trajectories all suggest rapid increases in density for pine, even peaking pretty close to performance age, but maybe 20 years or so afterwards. So if you initialize the Gypsy model with data collected at age 14, the Gypsy model is going to predict density only to decrease. Yet the data suggests that for most species groups, density is going to continue to increase before it decreases. And for spruce, that increase could go on for decades. So my suggestion is that the implied trends in Gypsy, at least when the model is used for these very young post-harvest stands, is not rational. And it's going to lead to some difficulty in generating accurate predictions using that model. So because I have remeasured data in the EPH remeasured data set, I can compare observed to predicted, the observations in the data set to those predicted by the model. So just as a guide for you to understand some plots that follow, ideally everything falls on the one-to-one line, observation matches prediction. And for density or stocking in time, we would expect density or stocking to decline because of self-thinning. So ideally, the observations fall on the line, and with time, they move straight down the line towards 0. And the blue lines give examples of problems. For top height or basal area, we also hope the observations fall on the line, but they should move up the line to the right because top height or basal area should increase with time. So that's ideal. So keep that in mind as I show you the next couple graphs. So the first graph is for pine. And so the hollow circles were when these historic stands were remeasured first in the EPH1 project, and the filled circles were when they were remeasured the second time, about 7 or 8 years later. Where the dots originally fall give you some idea of how observed and predicted density changes. And this is when the model was initiated with the youngest stand data available. We're closer to age 14. On the left, you can see observed density against predicted density. Those arrows are all pointing down, except for a few, with a few exceptions, which is good, but they're scattered all over the place. On the right-hand side, you can see stocking. Again, the arrows are pointed down, mostly straight down, instead of down along the one-to-one line. And part of the problem here is the effect of Western gall rust, or WGR trees. So the protocol for processing performance survey data in Alberta is to assume that trees that have Western gall rust galls in the main stem that exceed 50% of stem encirclement are going to die and not make it through to final rotation. So they're just dropped when compiling inventory data to initialize the model. Well, between two measurements, or at least between two different field crews, a lot of crews called these galls at the second measurement as exceeding 50%. So all these arrows that point straight down reflect huge declines in stocking that really don't exist in the real world because the trees are still alive. So the bottom line is, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but the results do suggest that the use of the Gypsy model is strongly affected by how Western gall rust is treated when using the model for simulation, even when using stands that are 20 to 40 years of age when they're compared down the road. The flip side, for spruce, on the left we have density and on the right we have stocking. You can see all of the arrows are pointing straight up. Well, most of them, I should say. There's a few oddballs, but lots of them pointing straight up. Generally speaking, when initializing the model with regeneration phase data, so data from down near 14 years, the observed densities are far greater than the predicted stocking at 30 to 50 years of age in these stands. Not only that, the arrows are all pointing up, meaning that the error or the discrepancy between what the model predicts and what's observed is actually getting worse. And this reflects that pattern I showed you earlier about continuing ingress of spruce through time. Over there on the right-hand side, you can see the results for stocking. The arrows are all pointing straight up, meaning that the model is predicting in most cases almost no change in stocking, but observed stocking is increasing in many cases. And that's because there's continued ingress in spruce. Now, this is just stocking and density, which are really important variables driving stand development and the Gypsy model. We can also look at top height and basal area. And I did this for all species groups, but I noticed that the predictions for white spruce were particularly problematic. On the left, we have the observed and predicted top heights. This again, initializing the model with the top heights and ages that were available at age, well, not just 14, but sometimes a little bit less and up to about age 20, and then growing the stands forward for 20 or 40 years. You can see the data are clustered all over the place. Most of them are off in the bottom of the side of that square, which implies that predicted top heights are far greater than observed for many of the spruce in the stand. That might reflect an overestimate of site index, but a significant amounts of variability. Good news is, for the most part, those arrows are pointed along the gray line. So the model is forecasting changes in top height that are similar to what is observed, although some of them, particularly when the observed top heights are low, are off. So again, I'm thinking maybe that's site index. But over there on the right, the results for basal area are really actually all over the map. There are cases where observed basal areas are as high as 5, but predicted to be 0, and where lots of basal areas were observed to be 0 and predicted to be 5. That's a pretty strong mismatch between observed and predicted basal area. And it meant the model was really struggling to actually forecast the dynamics for white spruce in these young post-harvest stands. Okay, I'm going to finish with just summarizing the main conclusions from the project. Again, there's a lot more that's in the final report, and I encourage you to read that if you have time and interest. But my first conclusion is that declaration to either broad cover group, BCG, or base 10 stratum, the broader classification Alberta, has questionable utility in the context of reforestation. I'm not saying stratification or declaration, sorry, is a bad thing, but in the context of reforestation, it doesn't appear to provide any information because there's no time dimension. And we know from the data that there's a significant amount of change in stand composition through time, especially for stands with a large spruce component. So assessing success based on declaration at age 14 has questionable utility. I think there's clear evidence that shifts in composition or in condition based on composition and structure occur after performance age in ways that are really relevant for assessing reforestation success and for projecting stand development. And these include accurate forecasts of composition and yield. Some stands become rapidly conifer dominated and stay that way, but others, there are subtle shifts that persist for decades. And those shifts are extremely important when evaluating reforestation success. Again, so the time dimension is very important. When I defined stand composition as a stratum, there was a weak silviculture signal. But when I defined stand composition as a continuous variable, as density, there was a strong silviculture signal that observed. And overall, this suggests that stand composition can and effectively is regulated by silviculture in Alberta, which is a really positive result. Finally, there's more information in the report, but site index seemed to be problematic to me in Alberta for several reasons, not the least of which is the common usage of site index based on total age, which introduces a vegetation competition effect. But instability in site index with age is not one of the problems. Measurement error is also another problem. Finally, the accuracy of the Gypsy model, in almost every context that I evaluated it, was problematic. And the inability of the model to reproduce the observed patterns in the data just really stopped me from looking to see whether those patterns were affected by silviculture. Finally, the data sets that were available to me were all very valuable. They're large and comprehensive, and there's a significant investment in those data that gave tremendous amount of statistical and practical power for teasing out these silviculture relationships. I did make some recommendations on improvements to the PIGGY data and to the EPH project database that would make these data even more useful.